Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, August 19th, 2024. Happy first day of the Democratic National Convention. As we are less than 80 days out from the presidential election this coming November, Donald Trump's campaign team looks like it's on track for a potential shakeup as Donald Trump is exploring the opportunity to fire his campaign managers, Susie Wiles and Chris LaCivita, two people who have been with the Trump campaign since the beginning of his November 2022 announce, members of his campaign inner circle that potentially have been leading him astray when it comes down to national numbers and in his opposition against Vice President Kamala Harris. Now, the discussions around Donald Trump and his campaign have really only come as of late, as the numbers have really narrowed for the former president. When he was up 5-6 points in nearly every single swing state against Joe Biden, the numbers have gotten far closer and in some cases have actually moved over to Vice President Harris. When we take a look at where we are in a number of the battleground states, we can see that against Biden, Donald Trump was absolutely demolishing. In Arizona, the Trump versus Biden numbers had Trump up 5.8%. Today, he's up on average by 0.2, according to Real Clear Politics. And even in Nevada, a state where Trump had done phenomenally well in comparison to where he was in 2016 and 2020, losing the state twice, both by 2.4%. In 2024, his numbers were up 6 points against Joe Biden, up 7 in the most recent poll taken before Joe Biden dropped out of the race. Today, nearly a month later, Donald Trump only maintains a 1-point advantage. And as you continue, in Wisconsin, it's another perfect example of Donald Trump being up 3 points against Biden, being down a point against Kamala Harris. Being down in a swing state like Wisconsin is a really bad sign, as it was the closest Biden state out of the Rust Belt states. And one of the polls suggests that that might be true yet again. In Michigan, Donald Trump is losing by 2 points to Kamala Harris. In Michigan, was up 2 points against Joe Biden, a universal 4-point shift in both Wisconsin and in Michigan. When it comes down to Pennsylvania, Real Clear Politics is holding on to this Trump lead by really the narrowest of margins. Trump is up 0.1% against Kamala Harris here. We expect this lead to change in favor of Kamala Harris, a massive uptick in support for the Democratic nominee here, but against Biden, it was a 4.5% race. And so across the Rust Belt region, a universal 4-point swing in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania that is now translated to states like Arizona and Nevada, and again is not a good sign for Donald Trump in the slightest. North Carolina being within a point, Georgia being within a point. These are all states that Biden was being demolished in the matchup against Donald Trump, a 4-point race in the state of Georgia against Trump for Biden, a 5-point race in North Carolina. Both of them now only have Trump ahead by 1, and recent polls, really strong, high-quality polls like the New York Times and Siena College, an A-plus rated pollster, have Kamala Harris ahead by 2 in North Carolina. And so really in large, what I've come to understand over the past few weeks is that there is something fundamentally flawed about the top of the ticket on the Republican side. The political instincts that the Trump campaign has exhibited would tell me that if they were in a different circumstance, the 2016 or 2020 elections, when we were talking under a Biden presidency, this would have been a campaign that was on track to lose. In 2016, he had the right people to meet the moment. In 2020, he very clearly did not. Donald Trump lost the election and just couldn't overcome the amount of support that President Biden had across these battleground states. But it was this election that was really where Donald Trump came into it being the front runner. Ever since he announced in November of 2022, the numbers looked more favorable for Donald Trump than any election prior. And when you take a look at the national numbers, you can even agree to that point too. Even compared to 2020, Donald Trump was losing on the national polls on election day by 8.4%. Today, Kamala Harris only leads by 2.7%. That is a vastly different margin, but it's also a margin the Democrats are quite thrilled about because at the same time, they look at this from the perspective of where they were under Biden. And also the fact of the matter is that the quiet Trump supporter that you saw in 2016 became less apparent in 2020 is even less apparent in 2024. And in the immediate aftermath of the assassination attempt on the former president, the amount of outpoured support we saw from nationally, at least outspoken support from Republicans, even independents who leaned right-wing, people like Elon Musk, celebrities that had really stayed out of the fray, largely speaking. Elon Musk isn't really that type of guy, but generally speaking, we saw that a lot of the celebrities who were pro-Trump, pro-right-wing, which we knew were Republicans, came out of the woodwork and ended up supporting the former president really in full force. And they did so as this display of consistent GOP unification, that there was no fractured Republican Party. The Never Trump vote now ceases to exist. And while they were very much covering up for that 20-30% that Nikki Haley, support Nikki Haley was getting across these battleground states and across the Republican primaries, at large, the front was that the Republicans were unified and the Democrats were fractured. Fractured because they had a nominee, Joe Biden, who many Democrats did not want to run for re-election, and now it was a question of will he drop out of the race or will we be forced to run with him in the general election? And so because of that fractured party, Biden's numbers really dipped. You saw that he was doing pretty badly when it came down to overall approval rating, overall sentiment, excitement, enthusiasm numbers, and of course, electability numbers that now Kamala Harris does miles ahead of where Joe Biden was, is miles ahead of where he was when he dropped out of the race nearly a month ago. I mean, I kid you not, it was less than a month ago that Joe Biden dropped out of the race, and so much has turned around. And so in understanding all of this together, something went wrong on the Donald Trump campaign, because it is an election where Donald Trump has maintained a lead for every single day of the campaign. CNN reported on this a month ago when all the conversations were happening around whether or not Joe Biden should drop out of the race. In 2020, from announcement point of Joe Biden's candidacy through the election, Donald Trump led on exactly 0 days in the national popular vote polls. In 2024, against Joe Biden, from announcement to the election, or up until Joe Biden dropped out, over 50% of the days, Donald Trump led. And in the year 2024, practically speaking, primary season through the general, exactly 0 days did Joe Biden lead Donald Trump on the national level. So the situation was certainly dire for Democrats. You saw that even in my predictions. We saw Joe Biden, in any circumstance, even if he was doing well, was doing far worse than where he was in 2020. And my last prediction before he dropped out of the race had him performing worse than Donald Trump in 2020, worse than Hillary Clinton in 2016. In fact, and I say this a lot, would have been the worst Democratic performance, I think, worst Democratic performance for any Democrat in the 21st century. And so Joe Biden dropping out of the race very clearly benefited the Democratic Party. You can see that in battleground states. You can see that nationally. You can see that on a monetary sense. Every single metric we look at, Joe Biden dropping out of the race was correct. Donald Trump's response to it was not. And so that's where I think we're getting into this conversation where it is really becoming a more dire circumstance for the Republican Party, as the numbers only get better for Kamala Harris. When she was announced into this race, her lead was under a point. Today, she's up 3 nationally. And again, in these swing states, where Trump's lead has been completely demolished, either being up 6, 7 points, now down to 1, being up in a state by 3, being down 1, being up 2, being down 2. It is like the entire country has been flipped upside down, and arguably, when I say the entire country, I really mean the 10% of the Electoral College and 10% of voters that actually do sway presidential elections. But it is these groups of people that we really come to see decide this election, and they now perceive this election very, very differently. And it's not as if Donald Trump hasn't made moves like this in the past. What we saw was back in 2019, when there were some polling leaks. Donald Trump decided to fire some of his campaign staffers. But his big move that he made came in July of 2020, when he replaced his campaign manager, as the numbers looked really bad. When you take a look at those 2020 numbers, around the time that Donald Trump made this decision, it was looking pretty dire for the Republican Party. They were down 10 points nationally, and arguably, maybe the argument can be made, maybe, that Donald Trump replacing his campaign manager went from him being down 10 points nationally to 8 points nationally to 5 points on election day, sure. But it was still a loss on the presidential level. And Donald Trump shaking up his campaign manager does show that he absolutely has it in him to change things right before an election. Granted, July is about a month earlier than where we are today, but it was still a shakeup. It was a shakeup that really ricocheted across the United States and across specifically the Republican Party. Because while Donald Trump did keep on his campaign manager as a quote-unquote senior advisor, this is the nice way of doing it in politics, where you push them to the side and you bring in somebody new. But it was clear at this moment in 2020 that something needed to change. The reality, I think, right now that the Trump team is starting to realize is that they should have had this coming to this moment of realization far, far earlier in the campaign season. But it was Joe Biden that made it very difficult to foresee any of this happening. The entire Republican convention happened just the weekend of Joe Biden dropping out of the race. I mean, I kid you not, the RNC was happening at this time. And so the Republican Party spent the entirety of the RNC. They announced the VP nominee, J.D. Vance. They were coming off of an assassination attempt against former President Trump. And the RNC had taken on this new idea of unification. In practice, did they actually know? In theory, they tried. And Donald Trump, of course, rambled on in his RNC speech, but nobody watched it. Why? Because a lot of us sort of assumed this election was a wrap, right? This election was said and done for. Donald Trump was going to get a second term, and now it was about the margin. And that is the way that the Trump campaign has really been operating, not since the assassination attempt, not since J.D. Vance, not since the RNC, since last year. We saw Chris LaSavita very publicly talking to the campaign media. And the Republican narrative had been, Joe Biden is going to lose this election. Now let's figure out how do we win by even more. There was no conversation around could there be a replacement. There was no conversation around could Joe Biden actually win this thing. And so the Trump team was really taken aback when Joe Biden dropped out of the race. Nobody on the Republican side genuinely thought that he would do it. And they had hoped that he would stay in the race because they knew he was the candidate that they wanted to run against. Do they also think that Kamala Harris, in theory, could be weaker? Possibly. Sure. Right? Her approval ratings at the time were worse than Joe Biden's. But she has done something that no Republicans could have really accounted for, and that has completely rebounded her approval. On the day that Joe Biden dropped out of the race, Kamala Harris's approval rating was down 16 points nationally at 36.8%. Nearly just a third of Americans approved of Kamala Harris's job or had a favorable view of her. Her approval rating as vice president was far worse. Hers were even lower than Joe Biden's. And it was also a notable point that Kamala Harris hit her lowest point in favorability just a week before Joe Biden dropped out of the race. The lowest point, not just of the campaign season, but of her entire vice presidency, the lowest point ever for Kamala Harris. And yet, in just around a month, being down 16 points, she has now turned it down to being down just 3 nationally. Her approval ratings are at 45%, her disapproval at 48%. That is a 3-point difference nationally from what was 16 points in just under a month. I can only imagine between now and November how much she can go ahead and change this around. And that's why the Republican Party really did not expect this and has no rebut to this, because their entire campaign has been built on this idea that it is Donald Trump against Joe Biden. It is Sleepy Joe, Dementia Joe, whatever term they wanted to use. They were characterizing the incumbent president as someone who was senile, couldn't serve out this term, couldn't be the next president of the United States. And many Americans agreed with them. But they don't agree when it's Kamala Harris who's the Democratic nominee. And what we've also found, too, is that Donald Trump is already beginning this indication that he is exploring the possibility of changing up his campaign staff, now bringing back on Corey Lewandowski from his 2016 presidential campaign. He's shaking up his campaign. Whether it happens at the top or happens amongst mid-level staffers, Donald Trump realizes Kamala Harris is now on track to win this election for the first time for Democrats of this cycle. They were all trying to play catch-up against Donald Trump. Now he's on the back end. They're starting to feel how it felt back in 2020, and that's not a good feeling for the Trump team because in his heart, Donald Trump knows he lost the election. In their hearts, too, they agree. And so working under this assumption that they're somehow going to landslide win this election no longer works because the Democratic opposition no longer exists to allow something like that to happen. Joe Biden may have been in a position where, sure, there could have been a shock and he could have won the election. I give it less than a 20, maybe 25% chance maximum at the time after the presidential debate. And that's not a good place to be, very obviously. But I wouldn't be surprised if we were in a circumstance where Joe Biden narrowly won the race, 270 to 268 or 276, right? Very narrow margin, but still a victory nonetheless. That is not where we are today. Kamala Harris has that 270. She's not guaranteed the election, and I don't think any Democrats in any circumstance should be complacent. But she has the ability to get well past 270. And in some cases, so does Donald Trump. But it is a race that is exceptionally narrow, and this one tunnel vision lens that the Trump team has had and maintained over the past year is the reason why, if they lose the election, they lose the election. It's the same type of thinking that they were saying, we're going to win this election. Why not set up someone like J.D. Vance to leave your legacy? Even stronger for the Trump team. Why not allow him to run in 2028? Sure, you could choose someone like Doug Burgum, but he's 71 years old. He's not going to run after 4 years because then the age argument circulates back. And sure, Donald Trump is older than Doug Burgum, and we can talk about that in so many different ways. But Doug Burgum is no Donald Trump. And J.D. Vance really is also no Donald Trump. And J.D. Vance being the pick for vice president, they might have known was not going to be this massive value add, but they thought it didn't matter. And it, again, is that type of political thinking where there were no thoughts beyond Trump, good, Biden, bad, that lead to decisions like this, where there are no thoughts beyond just simple understandings of where we are in the electorate and not accounting for any other type of circumstance, which is why I think we're now in this position. We're sure Trump is in a tight spot. We're 80 days out from the race, less than 80 days out. Trump can't really fire his campaign manager. Can he shake up the people below him? Absolutely, and he's already started to do that. But the people at the top really can't change unless he wants to completely restart this operation. Chris LaSavita, as much as he has led Donald Trump astray equally, is the reason Donald Trump has gotten this far in this race. Because based on the way he's been acting on Truth Social, this is not the Trump of 2016 or 2020. This is a very different Donald Trump. And they found a way to harness him. And against Joe Biden, they did it correctly. But they couldn't expand beyond that. And they still can't. We are a month after Joe Biden has dropped out of the race, and Donald Trump's campaign still has no way to characterize her, no real substantive attacks on her. They don't know how to handle her candidacy or Governor Tim Walz, and it's showing. And now the considerations are happening at the very top, with Donald Trump exploring the possibility to get rid of his campaign managers to save himself and his campaign, which might be doomed 80 days out. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist of my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.